right now. This makes it easier for you to share with coworkers or go back in case you missed something or need to drop before we end. Other things I'd like to encourage participation during the meetup, so feel free to speak up in case you have any questions. You can also post them in chat. I will pause every now and then for questions. The recording and the slides will be shared tomorrow on the meetup page and also on our website, so you get a full copy of everything in case there's reference material. I am going to add that too. And I think that's about it for now. So let's get to the outline and then let's get straight to it. Planning poker, it was a suggestion by somebody in the meetup actually 2 sessions ago, like, why don't we talk about this more? In the last 2 meetups, we sort of talked about this quite a lot actually. So I'm happy that we can finally officially talk about this. Let's see where that takes us. So we're first going to briefly address like the evolution of estimation. So where did we come from? Where do I think we are right now, according to my observations and those of my coworkers? Then we're going to look at relative versus absolute estimations. So as a lay in the groundwork for why we're doing something different than say ours. And then I'm going to introduce the concept of story points, which is all about relative estimations and assigning that a numeric value. And then finally, really the thing that we came here for, which is planning poker, which is sort of using story points in a way and applying it to your backlogs. And then obviously at the end, there's closing rooms for questions and things like that. So just a little bit of a background sort of evolution, I call it. So back from the old days, I'd like to say hours have been used for estimations. Ever since we've been doing IT work, we've been estimating work, I guess, because like we all want to answer the question, when is it done? Traditionally, we have been giving answers that were, well, we all sort of knew like, well, might not make that, but just fingers crossed that things might change in our favor. Didn't always happen that way, to be honest. And at one point, like in history, people started saying, well, hours are probably not the best way to do it. So I've seen it evolve. And I remember a conference in 2010, 2011, where they were talking about half days and full days. Like we're just not going any smaller than that because like we can't really tell because every time we do it, it might be a little bit different. So the natural evolution from that was, so now we're doing half days, full days. It's like a rougher estimate goes into something like t-shirt sizing or story points, which is even like more detached from hours, if you will, and sort of slides into that relative estimation skill. But for some, it doesn't, right? So a lot of what I still see, even at my current client, is that they're using story points and then hours, right? So either it's story points linked to hours or it's story points for like user stories, product backlog items, and then hours for tasks, something like that. There's also like big groups that don't estimate at all. They might still do some hours on task level, and then beyond that, there's like nothing out there. So, and I personally think far too few companies, teams, whatever, use story points or more importantly, relative estimation. I don't think you have to use story points because like it's up to you, like whatever works for your team is the best thing to use. But I do think a lot more companies can at least benefit from going through relative estimation and exercise and doing it for a little bit and then seeing where they end up. There's also movements towards, or there has been around for a while now, no estimates or like right sizing, like sizing every work item the same. That does require you to be a little bit mature as a team in order for it to work, but it's a good technique if it works for you. And then I want to refer back to my comment about whatever works for your team, right? So we are going to be talking about planning poker today. It is a practice within the Agile landscape. Nothing here is mandatory for you in order to be successful with Agile, in order for you to do Agile, but it can be incredibly helpful, and especially teams that have trouble forecasting, trouble identifying the right workload for a sprint. I'd say this is something you can definitely give a shot. So let's first go to something very foundational, right? So relative versus absolute estimations. Absolute estimations are things like hours, miles, pounds. It's like an absolute number. There's like an undeniable scale there. It's been standardized, right? There's only one. A mile always means a mile. Hours always means like time as defined. Pounds is like an absolute thing. And then there's relative estimations like, hey, it's sort of twice as large or sort of twice as long, maybe 3 times as many. And as you can see the difference there, right, the relative estimations allows for a little bit more flexibility and wiggle room, because if it, like the difference between 40 and 20 or 41 and 20 is still about twice as many, right? So, but there's a little bit of flexibility there. So the gist of this is that humans are a lot better at relative estimations than at absolute estimations. And as an example, I've sort of borrowed this picture, the source is in there, from the internet. And if you look at it, you can see a map of Australia and then several other countries plotted on top of it, right? So if I would ask any of us, myself included, like what's the square mileage of Australia or the United Kingdom? Like we'd all get a number out there. Maybe one of us gets close, but we're nowhere near to what it exact is. And well, there's like an astronomical chance like one of us would get it right. But that's not something we as humans are good at, because there's like no skill, like nothing to compare it to. Like we might know what a square mile is, but we can't really pin it down at like an area that size. But if I would ask the question, like how many times can you fit the United Kingdom and Ireland into Australia, then we're all going to be ending up in the same sort of range. Like, and I'm sort of like roughly guessing 9 to 11 would be the range that we end up in. The same for Japan, New Zealand. Europe's about the same size, same in the United States, same with Southeast Asia, right? So it's a lot easier to estimate, like, first of all, if it's like relative, because like you don't have to be absolute. And second of all, if you have some sort of baseline to compare things to. And that baseline to compare things to, that is really, really fundamental when you're talking about planning poker. So now we've had relative versus, oh, first of all, let me ask, are there any questions so far about this? All right, good. So now that we've talked about this, let's move on to story points. So story points is a numeric skill that was introduced to allow you to do relative estimations, but be able to assign a numeric value to something, right? So t-shirt sizing really doesn't offer you this advantage, because small, medium, large, like how do you add that up? Like even if you do that, right, it could be helpful to differentiate different kinds of sizes and work, but it doesn't really allow you to compare or properly set sort of capacity for what we can do in a sprint or an iteration or to forecast. So this sort of Fibonacci skill, right, was introduced for relative estimations. And the beauty of this is, well, first of all, sort of Fibonacci, right, because it goes, Fibonacci is 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, then goes on from there. This is why it goes from 0 and then 20, 40, 100, because that's typically like sort of outside of the scope that most people operate in. So, but also because the gap gets bigger, right, as you do like rougher or larger estimations for like more complex or a piece of work or work with more effort, like the gap gets bigger. So there's like more flexibility and padding in there to allow you to still like sort of have some sort of sensible estimation. And the thing here is that the value of the number itself doesn't matter, right? It's not relevant. The relative value to something else is, right? So there's an example down here. So the number 5 for car doesn't mean anything in itself, just a 5, right? And somebody decided to assign this to a car. And we estimated that, well, yeah, bus is a little bit bigger than a car, right? So that's going to be 8. A truck, however, an 18-wheeler, is going to be a lot bigger. So it's going to be a 13. And the skateboard, I would sort of assign it a half. The normal decks like have like half in there, is a lot smaller than a car. But now imagine this, like what if we would just like move this skill up like a notch down? So the skateboard would be 1, the tricycle would be 2, the cycle would be 3, the scooter would be 5. Still works, right? Relative to each other, it's still roughly appropriate, but it's different numeric value. So the number itself doesn't matter. It's really relative to so like what your baseline is. And that's one of the most important things of relative estimation. Remember the maps I showed you before? Like if you don't have Australia there, what is there to compare to, right? You don't have a baseline. So how many times bigger is like Japan compared to what exactly? So if you don't have a baseline, you're using story points, you're still going to be guesstimating without any sort of reference, right? And that's where it usually goes wrong in my experience. I see a lot of teams just starting to use story points and then just start going at it without assigning any sort of baseline. And then you're assigning numbers to countries, for example. That doesn't really work because then you're not doing relative estimation, you're just assigning story points. And that's a super slippery slope, because what happens then is like, we got nothing to compare it to, so why don't we link it to ours? And then what you've done is you've made relative estimations absolute because you've linked it to something absolute, right? So if you're assigning story points to hours, you're not doing planning poker. You're just using a different means of assigning hours to something, right? As to my previous example, right? So you can slide the scale back and forth. The value of a story point is different from team to team. Each team sets their own baseline. And even if you use the same piece of work as a baseline among across different teams, they can still assign a different value to it, right? So there's no point of standardizing this because that's not the point. Again, it's relative estimations. It's relative to what you identify as a baseline. And that is completely arbitrary, right? We do say there's typically like a 3 or a 5 assigned to that baseline because that's sort of like nicely in the middle of the what I call like the operating part of the skill. By the time you get to like 40 and 100, you're talking like massively bigger than whatever's down in the lower end of the skill. So to me, those kind of work items would always sort of fall into the category of you might want to split that up. That's not always necessarily the case, but that's typically what happens, right? So you want to pick something sort of in the middle of like under the 20 range. 3 is a super popular choice, but I see a lot of 5s also. Some go for a 1, but the danger with like doing a 1, for example, is that like it blows up quite significantly for a larger piece of work, or you're going to end up like mostly operating in this range, and this part of range doesn't have that flexibility, that doesn't have like the sort of padding, I'd say, that the 8, 13, and 20 have. So it's different from team to team, right? So that also means that you cannot compare something like velocity, which I'll explain in a second, across teams, because the skill for every team is going to be different. So the numeric nature of story points really allows teams to track velocity, right? So at the end, say this is your first sprint using this. At the end of the sprint, you're going to accumulate all the story points of all the work items you've completed, like full work items completed. Don't not the math, just add up those story points and say like, hey, we completed 40, right? That's your velocity. That's the amount of story points you can complete. Don't do like half items. Like if something's assigned an 8 and you haven't completed it, you haven't completed it. Don't start doing math, dividing 8 by 2 and adding the 4, because then you're cheating the skill, right? You want to know what you can finish, what you can complete in a sprint. If you can't complete that 8, if you haven't completed that 8, obviously you couldn't do it, right? Over time, that will flatten out, because once you've done that first sprint, you're going to do this over and over again. So as more sprints get completed, you get like different velocities per sprint, and you're going to get that average, right? So after 3 sprints, you have an average across 3 sprints. And that sort of becomes a proper velocity that you can then start using at sprint planning to sort of identify how much work can we select. So say you've estimated all the items in your backlog, in your product backlog, and you're at sprint planning and your average velocity is 42, and you've selected 82 points worth of work. That should be a telltale sign that, hey, something's a little bit wrong here. We might be overloading ourselves, right? The same goes for forecasting, right? So once you have that average number and you have like 100, say your average like 42, and you got 140 in your full product backlog, what you can do is say, well, that's going to be about 4 sprints of work approximately, right? So you can sort of forecast and use that to create transparency about these things. And that really is about the extent of it, right? So that's what velocity is really useful for. It's not a performance metric. Again, it's nothing absolute. It's something relative. It's really a tool for the team to allow them to better forecast, to allow them to do sprint planning, right? Performance, a different topic. Value delivery, again, it's a different topic, right? You can do 100 points and deliver no value at all, right? This is just for forecasting and sprint planning, right? And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Don't assign hours or half days or whatever to story points, because you're going to be bringing it back to an absolute skill. And then you're not doing relative estimations, right? So you sort of trashed your advantage if you do that. I'm going to pause again, see if there's any questions at this point or any remarks or experiences. Feel free to share.
Hey, Martin, this is Tom Shaver. I love the graph or the picture of the Fibonacci sequence with the vehicles. I love this. I've seen this done a lot of different ways, but this is really, really cool, and it's really self-explanatory. So I appreciate you showing this.
Sure.
I was trying to explain to people the other day about the Fibonacci sequence, and they were sort of getting lost in the whole like 2, 3, 5, 8 range and trying to figure out exactly, well, how much is it different? But just having this picture here really clearly says, hey, it's relative effort, and here it is. So anyway,
Yeah, this
just
is
want
a
to call
good
that
one.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pictures on the internet, but not a lot of ones that I liked. I agree with you. This is a very good picture. The source is on there, so you can go back and he didn't source it, so I'm not even sure where it's coming from. I just found it, but it's a good picture to explain it. You have different pictures also with dogs, like sizes of dogs, and some with countries, but like this is one of the better ones. But I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah,
that.
man.
Cool. Any other questions at this point? All right, so let's go to the one thing that we all came here for, I'm sure, planning poker itself. So planning poker is the act of assigning story points to work items. And I say work items because there are so many different ways, shapes, and forms that you can sort of like voice work in. It could be product backlog items, user stories, tasks, epics, features. Again, there's no rules, right? There's no book that says you have to do this or have to do that. And even if there is a book, you can safely ignore it because it works regardless of what the book says, right? So that's really up to you. I see a lot of people assigning it to the product backlog item level. So like typically user stories on a product backlog, and then just adding tasks without anything in there because that doesn't really matter. But again, that's going to be completely up to you. Planning poker is just so like the game you play in order to assign values to work. So how this typically, so I'm first going to like go into the semantics of it, and then I'm going to go to the mechanics of it. The next slide. So either you're using physical cards, right? You have lots of planning poker decks that you can order online. However, especially due to COVID, with people being remote, but also before that time for distributed teams, there's lots of tooling available. Personally, I've been using the one from Azure DevOps recently, and I have to say I like that quite a lot. It's just very simple, straightforward, and it does what it's supposed to do. I'm sure there's a Jira and other tooling equivalent to that. Just don't make it too fancy. All you need is like the cards and the ability for people to click a card and for it to be hidden until somebody presses like show all the values, right? Everybody participates, right? So all the developers, or formerly development team, if you're talking a Scrum Guide lingo. And I say developers in a team, and I don't mean only the software developers. I mean everybody who is part of the team delivering the work. Scrum Master facilitates, product owner doesn't participate, right? And the reason why I'm very strong on product owner doesn't participate, because the product owner always, the product owner's interest is delivering as much value as possibly can, right, and maximizing that value. So if the product owner continuously undercuts the estimations of the developers, that might introduce some sort of implied pressure to the developers, like maybe we should lower the estimates. And again, you're undercutting the whole purpose of this, right? Again, the numbers by themselves don't even mean anything, and it's not in a product owner's interest to sort of force their team into that corner, because the one thing that's going to suffer again is going to be quality, right? They're just going to be cutting corners under the pressure. So it's like shooting yourself in the foot, like big time as a PO. So it's really just the developers, and they all participate, right? Even if they don't really know what's going on, right? They might have some insights. But even if they don't have that, right? If somebody doesn't know what it's really about, they can ask questions, or they will learn from whatever happens there in the conversations that take place, right? And again, you need that baseline, right? Again, typically a 3, can be a 5. That's my recommendation. And that needs to be established for this to work. Otherwise, again, you're just assigning random numbers to something without a skill. It's not relative estimation. It's just like assigning story points based on nothing. And a good baseline is an average amount of work. Average. It's totally arbitrary, as you can hear, that has been completed and which everyone understands, right? So the teams that I coach, they're typically picking something they've done over the past 4 weeks. That's sort of like everybody knows it. Examples for like web applications are like, well, introducing like creating like a new module or something, or a new web page or contact form, or making certain changes. Or it could be like adding a button to a desktop application, or it could be like creating adding like a new piece of business logic into the backend, or database changes. Like it can be really broad, but it's typically not the most sophisticated piece of work, right? It's not like at this like super complex algorithm to your application kind of deal. But if that's your average amount of work, that's fine. Think of this though, like if your 3 is, or your average is like a ton of work and you can't fit it into a sprint, it's probably not the best baseline, right? Because you do want to have the ability to do a bunch of these in a sprint. So once you've agreed on that, and again, don't spend too much time on this, right? 15 minutes, something like that is what I typically need. Just settle on a baseline. You just need it as like a stick in the sand to compare it to. You know, we go like swimming out in the sea, you want to like keep track of the current, and that you're not like drifting too far. Like people put a stick in the sand on the beach, look around. So where you go, that's sort of what this is like. So where we'll just to compare it to, right? And it does take a couple of sprints for you to get used to this and become good at it. And I say good because what is good? Define good. Like if it works for you, you're good at it, right? So, but don't give up the first couple of sprints. Like the first couple of rounds of estimations are going to be really rough, right? So, and that's all part of it, right? You just got to plow through and get used to the practice. So once you've established that baseline, just estimate 10 things, right? Relative to the baseline, just so people can get used to it, right? 50 minutes on the baseline, then spent 45 minutes or an hour or an hour and a half, doesn't really matter, on estimating 10 items. People, just so people get a little bit of a feel for it. See a question here by Jenny. By developers, would you include the QA team in that? Yes, absolutely. Well, the interesting, QA team or the QA person on the team? I would say if that happens inside the same team, right? Yes, I would include QA in that. If you're doing development, then QA, what is sort of like waterfally, then I wouldn't include that, right? Because it's not the effort that that team does in their sprint, because they're likely going to hand it over to the QA team after that sprint, right? So if everybody who's part of the team and everybody who has something to do, you have to do it. So Max is saying our points are end-to-end, including BA to dev to QA cycle. I would say if it's in the same team, right? If you're doing it across, it's going to be hugely complicated because you're going to be estimating across different teams, right? This is a team estimate. It's a team baseline. And it's very hard to roll out that same baseline across different teams, especially if your teams have like separate disciplines, right? If you're using sort of component teams, because every team has a different kind of work. All right, so then how does it work? Once you've established that baseline, you can just start doing this, right? So again, everybody participates and everybody has a stack of cards with the values from the slide on it. And then somebody introduces a work item. Could even be the product owner doing this, right? Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Go
You
ahead.
mentioned previously about the developers being the ones doing the estimating, right?
Yes.
And the PO not participated. There's a line, if I can remember, on the Scrum, from Scrum org, about saying the product owner may influence the developers by helping them understand and select trade-offs. Are they
Yes.
referring to value?
They're referring to making sure they understand what needs to be done. right? So the product owner typically adds things or aids in adding things to the product backlog, and they help understand the team what needs to be done. So that's the aiding that they talk about specifically. And influence, and I know the words in there. I wouldn't say influence a way to pressure them to lower their estimations, but influence in a way to say like, well, think outside the box and what are like different things that you could do in order to deliver the same kind of value, right?
Okay.
So I'd say that would be, does that help?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does.
All right. Well, I've paused for some questions. So Sheila's saying a lot of times there are different teams involved in the same sprint. I want to go to a very conceptual thing just to clarify this, right? Because this is super fundamental. Each team does their own sprints. There's like no sprint with different teams. They can have like the same sprint cycle, but they're all like, it's like one team has their sprint, does their sprint, right? It's their time box. If there are 4 different teams, they each have their own time box, can be synchronous. You can even be part of like a safe agile release train, but I'd say that's all part of it. If you're doing things like Scrum and DevOps right, you have every discipline within the same single team, like a single autonomous unit that can deliver end-to-end value from like concept to all the way to like release, right? So that includes a lot of automation and everything. If you've got such a team, then the estimations cover everything. If you don't have that in your team, typically your estimation doesn't cover everything because you're going to hand it off to somebody else who's doing a whole different kind of work, right? Because QA or BA work is different from like actual software development work, right? So I'd say that's really important to remember, because if you've got all these different circumstances, complex team setups or muddied concepts, I'd say this is not going to work because of this. It's going to work because of this, the organizational setup, right? This works best if you've got the proper team setup, right? The end-to-end value teams. So just reading the questions out here. So Max and Anusha, I'm going to get to yours in a second. So Jenny's saying, is it normal to have a few QA members on a team? It's very, very normal to have QA in your team in Agile. I'm not going to go as far as saying it's a must, but consider this: if you want your team to be autonomous and be able to deliver end-to-end value, and QA is part of that, that's a very strong case there for having QA in your team and not handing it off to a different team. Because what you otherwise get is your developers make something, they just throw it over the fence to QA, who are going to pick it up in the next sprint. Then the developers move on. Then the next sprint QA finds something, goes back to the developers. They have to stop what they're doing, go back into the code that they were in the last sprint. It's really a bad cycle. You know, we keep seeing that over and over again because it's disruptive. It distracts from focus. It makes them less productive, actually. So it might be a good topic for next meetup, actually. Now that I think of it, DevOps. So QA, and then yes, Jenny, that's a very good question. So then the QA effort should be included. Yes, absolutely. If QA is part of your team that does the work in a sprint, you're going to be including that effort. Great questions. Awesome, people. So let me just walk through the mechanics and then we'll get to the other comments and questions that are in there, because this might clarify something or at least provide more context for an answer. So somebody introduces the work item and make sure people understand it, right? This was to the question before, like this is what the product owner might do, right? They might just say like, hey, this is what we're going to be building. This is what we're going to be creating. I want to add feature XYZ that includes this, this, and this. These are the acceptance criteria. Here's like an example or like a drawing or a wireframe of how I want it to look. Don't spend too much time on that, right? You're just creating transparency. Questions may be asked already. You just want to make sure that people understand. Once people understand, they're all individually going to pick a card, right? Everybody has like a deck of, like a stack of cards, or they got like the button on their screen, the whole range, and they're going to assign a value compared to that baseline, right? So if you think it's equal to your baseline is 3, you're going to say 3. It's a little bit more work. It's going to be 5. It's a lot more work. It's going to be 8. Like a humongous amount of more work. It's going to be 13, 20. So if it's a little bit less work, maybe 2, otherwise it's going to be 1 or even a half. It's like a tiny amount of work. Once everybody's picked their value and assigned that, you're going to be opening up the card. So if you're doing this physically, you're just going to pick a card, you put it on a table closed, right? And then you'll see when everybody's got their estimation. And once that's done, you're going to be opening them up. If it's virtual, there's a button that says reveal cards and everybody's going to see it, right? And then we're going to get to choices, right? If it's all the same estimation, my policy is always just move on. Is everybody did like a 5, just write down 5 because there's no disagreement there. And with the brains of the team, they're likely going to get to a solution that works. They likely think it's going to be about the same amount of work, right? And again, it doesn't matter because it's a relative skill, right? So it's not linked to anything absolute. So if everybody agrees, just moving on. But there's typically differences, and then we get to max's common, right? So you want to walk through the outliers. So for example, if there's like a 3, a 5, a 13, an 8 to 5, and a 1. You want to address the 1 and the 13 first because they are furthest out, right? So they are furthest apart and see like, hey, you say it's 1, so you think it's not a lot of effort or not really complex. So is this already done or something? You want to ask the 13, like, wow, did we miss something? Because that's like a lot more than the others are saying. And this is where one of the other huge advantages of planning poker and story points come in and relative estimations, is that conversation itself is really valuable because that can uncover things you hadn't thought about before, right? It's like, well, it seems like a trivial change, but there's like a lot of technical debt in that piece of the code that I know about. So it's going to be a lot more work in order to get that done. Or did you consider testing? Or did you consider that we need to change the user interface for this? Or it could be the other example that I gave, right? Oh, it's already done. It's just going to be a small tweak. And I know exactly where to do it. So just write down, like, ask Mary, and if she can point you to the right piece of code, and it'll be like a very small tweak. That's all perfectly legitimate. So once you've talked about that, you can either re-estimate or just agree on like what we're going to do here. Like, are you fine with a 3? Like, it really depends on how far along you are and what the differences are. If there's lots of 5s and 8s or something, I'd say like, is everybody going to be okay with an 8, depending on the conversation? If it's if like, you got like the full range of cards on there, you might want to do another round of estimations and see if you can get closer to like a common estimate. And then once you've done, you just write it on the card, like move on, right? Another one key thing, I got a lot of bold lines in here, I know, my apologies for that, but these are sort of like the disclaimers. If you don't do this, this is not going to work. Never average estimations or deviate from the skill, right? So we don't want to say, well, we got like 2 5s and 2 8s, so let's just settle at a 6.5. Again, you're breaking the skill. We have this skill for a reason, because the gap gets bigger, because as we're estimating something's larger, there's a bigger chance that there's going to be more obstacles or things you didn't know about. Again, we're not estimating time. We're estimating like, hey, how complex is this? Or how much effort is this? And if it's a lot of effort or really complex, there's more risk that you're going to hit some roadblocks, right? That there's something that you hadn't foreseen. And if it's really simple, if it's really not complex or really low effort, that chance is considerably smaller, right? But if you start averaging things out, you're going to take all of that away, all that padding for unforeseen things away. And you're making it a little bit more absolute than it needs to be, right? And again, so you don't want to say like 15 either. That's not in the skill. You got these options, you got to pick from these, right? So you got to settle on one. And my policy has always been, if it's like between a 5 and an 8, half 5, half 8. Is everybody going to be okay with an 8? The only thing that can happen is that it, again, it turns out to be less effort than you thought it would be, but that averages out in the skill over time anyway, right? So once you've been doing this for a bit, again, we're going back to velocity. You can start measuring that, and the skill becomes really useful to you. So one thing I forgot to put down now, thinking of, this is typically something you do typically you don't have to, in product backlog refinement, formerly called product backlog grooming, right? So when you look at the product backlog, you go over the items in there, you do the estimations before something's picked up in a sprint, right? Because if you do it afterwards, there's like no true point except if you're just starting with this and you want to start tracking that velocity, right? But you want to do it ahead of time so you can use these empirical numbers in your sprint planning in order to properly plan, right? So during product backlog refinement, if something last minute comes in, you can even do it during sprint planning. That's perfectly fine too. But if you pull this forward just a little bit, it makes your sprint planning a lot easier. So I know your question was, what are the factors that we consider while estimating? That's a very good question. So I've already said a little bit, right? Factors, I'd say, is complexity. Like, is there really like a lot of thought we're going into this? Again, if you're implementing a very complex algorithm, I'd say that's complex, right? Or if you're changing something very fundamental that has lots of dependencies, then complexity typically drives up the estimation. The other thing is amount of work, in the sense that, well, this is going to be a huge amount of code. It's going to be very trivial, but we're just going to add in like lots of business logic. It's all very modular. It's all very simple, but it's just going to take like time to go through it. So that typically drives it up. So I'd say effort and complexity are the two key drivers in this. A third one I'd say that I commonly use is risk. And this is especially one when you're working with third-party applications or APIs or something like that. If there's a certain risk involved there that something might not work or break, or you're like, this is probably going to be a little bit of a bumpy road because we're going to work with this vendor and go back and forth and back and forth. I'd say that sort of drives up the estimate as well. With the one side comment that don't estimate waiting effort, as I call it, right? If you got to send a request to like a third-party vendor, then sit back and wait for it. You're not actually going to do that. You're going to send out the request, which is super low effort, and you're going to wait for it to come back. And that might be in like 4 weeks. So you're just going to do different work. And by the time it gets back, you're in a different sprint. So then I'd say you don't count that effort. I hope that helps. Hope that makes sense.
That helps, Martin. What about the experience level of the developers?
That's another great question. It's a tricky answer. I'd say that typically averages out in the skill, because like the more junior developers will typically give a little bit of a higher estimation, because they're like, well, this is probably gonna be like a little bit more complex for me than like the really experienced developers. But throughout the conversation, that typically averages out in my experience. I'm not a huge fan of saying, well, you just do this because you're more experienced, because then you're assigning things to people. And again, you're removing all the flexibility you have in a sprint, and picking things up like from the order there in the backlog, right? So you don't want to assign that to people, because then one person's going to end up with a whole lot of work that they have to do, and other people are going to be sitting around. However, to my previous example, if somebody says, like the Mary example, like, I know that bit of code, I know exactly where to do it. Well, you'd be stupid if the difference is between a 1 and an 8 not to ask Mary where it is, right? You got to use your common sense there. So that's a little bit of a trial and error, I'd say, to work your way through that. So I wouldn't take it into account too much. It typically averages out in the scale, but if for one person it's going to be a small tweak, and for the other person it's going to mean like 2 weeks of digging into code because they don't know where to look. Again, it's not an estimation problem, an experience problem, but you want to be a little bit sensitive about that and seeing what you do with the estimation.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. Sure. Great question. Gowrie, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you. So I'm a new Scrum Master, so still learning the basics of like estimating.
Okay.
So I understand the estimation part, but then who actually comes up with the baseline? So I'm a little confused with coming up with the baseline, and then how is it compared to what people give, like their numbers?
That's a great question, and I actually didn't address that properly. My apologies. But that same group that does the estimations comes up with the baseline, right? So the same group that estimates everything. So in Scrum, you would call that the developers, formerly the development team. And again, a very unfortunate wording here, based on the conversation we had about QA and BA and everything. Somebody should slap Ken and Jeff against the head and say, like, pick a different term. I'd say the team that does the work, all the work involved, they set the baseline because they are going to be doing the estimations. So it's their skill because they estimate, so the baseline is going to be theirs as well. Nobody other than them can set or give them that baseline. They have to do it themselves.
Okay, so just as an example, if there's a story, a new story that has been created, so like in my experience, I've just seen a developer giving a story estimation for that particular story. So I don't know if there was ever a baseline that was decided for that. I'm not quite sure where that's fitting in.
Right. So very common scenario. You could just ask, like, what's your baseline? What are you comparing this to? Again, are you just estimating like countries, sizes by assigning random numbers to them? Because that's what it is. If there's no baseline, then it's not relative estimation. Then it's just a numeric scale, and then secretly it's going to be like linked back to hours, right? So if there's no baseline, the question is like, hey, what's your baseline? Did you like select a car as your baseline, and are you comparing that relative to the car, or are you just doing something? Well, you might want to play with the wording a little bit, because asking people, are you just doing something, might not be the most friendly way to do it. But yeah, just ask. And otherwise you can sort of
makes
introduce.
Sense.
Yeah. Okay. Hope it helps.
Makes sense. Yes. Thank you. That helps.
All right. I know the salary baseline is always in hours. Again, if they're not comparing it to like a piece of work, which Max rightly said, pick up an item from a past sprint, then you have a baseline. So yeah, estimations, it will be better over time. The first couple of sprints are very, very bumpy. I actually had the joy of being able to introduce this to a team again a couple of weeks ago. You know, we're doing a lot better, but the first session was like everybody, the question marks were flying around, and everybody's like, what am I supposed to do? First couple of sessions will be bumpy, will be messy. So they really got to find their rhythm. Absolutely right there, Max. Cool. Any other questions, remarks, comments? I'm going to pause for a little bit and then sneak in the topic for the next meetup, because I forgot to add that in. So if there's no more questions, this is all I had for today about planning poker. I hope this was useful to you. If you have to drop off right now or want to leave, oh, perfectly fine. I'd like to thank you very much for being here. The next meetup is going to be August 18th, 5 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to be Introduction to DevOps. Additionally, this is not on the slide. I'm not sure if there are any people from the Houston area here. I am going to be organizing an in-person meetup again, August 11th. It's going to be a lean coffee kind of thing. It's going to be low key, not too many people, but I do want to get that in-person stuff off the ground as well. So if you're from the Houston area and you're interested, please ping me and I can keep you up to date. And again, stay in touch. We're on LinkedIn and we are on proawareness.com. I'm going to be sharing the slides and recording tomorrow on the website and on a media page. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Again, thanks for being here. In case you need to drop, if you have any questions, feel free to stick around.